So my background is I'm a permaculture designer. I design forest gardens and I teach permaculture and forest gardening, etc, etc. So first question is, who knows anything about permaculture? Does anyone know what permaculture is? Yeah, a few people.
I could put into words.
So what do you guys think permaculture is?
Design for living.
Design for living. That's a nice description. Yeah.
Biodiversity.
Biodiversity.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sustainability. Fantastic.
Living within the environment, the bounds of the environment.
Yeah, exactly. So living according to your means and within, yeah, what's around you. What else? Okay, what does sustainability mean? I think
We had a wonderful,
David
actually. Yeah.
David gave a nice definition, and I would like to add just a little bit more onto what he said, in that, yeah, it's creating an environment or creating a system that is good for you, that meets your needs, but without depriving anyone else locally, without depriving anyone internationally of their needs, whether it's today or in the future. But my addition to that would be, it's not just about human needs, it's also about plants, animals, insects, everything. So it's about creating systems which actually add value to everyone, everything. So whatever it is you're taking out, you always make sure that you're putting much more into the system than you ever take out. So whatever you create in such a way that there's always abundance, and then you can afford to take out what you need as opposed to what you want. And so that for me is sustainability. So okay, what I'd like to invite you to do is just close your eyes. We'll go on a little kind of meditation. So I want you to imagine that you're in a forest. You're in a typical British forest. It's the summer. So the leaves are full, the canopy is full. Just note, what is it you sense while you're in there? How do you feel? Is it warm? Is it hot? Cold? Is it cool? What are you hearing? What are the sounds? What can you smell? Just imagine being in there. So maybe you can, now that you've started to get into this environment, maybe you can shout out, what is it you can see? What's the canopy like?
Dappled.
Dappled. Okay, what else do you see in there? What does it feel like in terms of temperature?
Humid.
Comfortable, I would say, yeah. So it's, while it may be really hot outside of the forest, but inside here it's kind of nice and cool and comfortable. And what kind of height are the trees? Are they all equally the same height, or is there some variations?
Different levels.
Yeah, lots of different levels. And how about on the ground? What do you see on the ground?
Debris from the trees.
Debris from the trees, yeah. Sorry?
Bilberries.
Bilberries. Okay, great. Would you find that in the middle of the forest, or maybe more towards the edges, where there's some slightly more than dappled sunlight?
Thick undergrowth in mine.
Yeah, so this thick undergrowth, let's have a look at that. So top layer is probably some kind of maybe leaves and twigs and half composted material, but so let's take a little bit of that away, and what do we start to see underneath there?
Oh, lovely
Life.
life, yes.
Life! It's amazing. Is it dry? Is it wet? Is it moist?
Damp.
It's damp, yeah. And what does it smell like?
Life.
Smells of life, exactly. It's beautiful. So, what's doing that? What's creating that?
All the organisms together.
All of the organisms, and there's millions, billions of different organisms in there that's creating that environment. Now, how much of your energy did you put into creating that? Do you go and do you water that environment? Do you add compost to it? No. And yet it is full of life. So let's speed up the seasons now. Let's move into actually, before we do that, let's imagine I mean, you were saying it was kind of maybe a little bit humid. Is it a bit? So where's all that water coming from? Why is it kind of feeling? Where's the moisture coming from in the soil?
It's retained.
It's retained. Yeah. Why is that?
Because of the forest layers above that are stopping the wind and the sun and all the things that drag moisture out of our gardens.
Yeah. So it's stopping the evaporation, and also as the trees suck up water from the ground, they bring them through their trunk, across through the different branches, to the little sub-branches, then to the leaves. From the leaves it goes down the main stem, through the veins, and then it transpires, it releases it. And that moisture remains inside your system. So imagine now it's coming to autumn. The leaves have done their bit, the trees have done their thing, they've fruited, the season's over, the deciduous trees start losing their leaves, they start drying up, and they start falling to the floor, and eventually you've got almost a bare forest. You've just got the evergreens, which are still nice and green. What's the temperature like now? What's the feeling like? What's the atmosphere like?
Cool.
It's cool because it's cooler generally outside. How much sunlight is now in this space?
More.
Depends whether there's clouds or not, I guess, in this country. But it's much brighter. You know, if the sun's out, it's much brighter. But there's hardly any growth now. The season's kind of over. So let's speed up through past winter and into spring, and all of a sudden you've now got warmth, and you've got sunlight. The sunlight is coming through because there's no leaves yet on the trees. What starts to happen? Growth. Yeah, the buds start coming out, bees start coming out, everything starts taking to life. What happens to the floor? What happens to the floor of the forest?
Start to come alive.
Yeah, what grows? What kind of things?
Ferns.
Okay,
Spring
ferns.
flowers.
Spring flowers. What kind of spring flowers?
Wood sorrels and
Violets.
Aconites.
Yeah, exactly. Lots of bluebells
Wild
and
garlic.
snowdrops and wild garlic, ramsons. And it just comes to life. And if it's a mature forest, if one particular plant has really done well there, you'll see an amazing sea of colour. Everything's come to life because you've got this sunlight. So let's kind of move on, and so the main reason why those plants have succeeded in that environment is because it's found its niche, it's found its right time when it can actually flower and propagate itself. It's a time when, as I say, there's no shade and where sunlight is coming through, and it's just about warm enough to trigger this off. So it's found its niche. Then as soon as the canopy starts to get thick, they start to die back because there's just not enough light. So how much abundance would you say is in that environment?
Uncountable.
Uncountable. It's an amazing amount of abundance, though how much of it is useful to us in terms of food and stuff, or in terms of medicine? Not a huge. There's plenty there, but it's not a huge amount of edible things for us. You couldn't survive just on food from there. So now let's go to the other extreme. Let's go to a meadow. So it's a plain meadow, you've got full sunshine. So whereas in the forest you had a lack of sunshine which stopped a lot of things from growing, now you're in a meadow where you've got unlimited sunshine. So how much variety is there? How much abundance is there?
More than in the forest.
More than in the forest, yeah. How much of it is edible? Again,
from the meadow.
a little bit more than what was in the forest, but still there's not a huge amount, is there? How about where the two systems meet? So where the forest meets the meadow. This is what we call an edge. So in permaculture we'll constantly be talking about edge, where two systems meet. Now, what do you see there? So now you've got plenty of sunlight. In some places you've got some shade. In some places you've got full shade, some places dapple shade. Some places are exposed to wind, some places are sheltered from wind. What do you find growing in there?
Brambles,
Berries.
Nettles.
Absolutely endless list of things.
sloes,
Yeah, there's so many different types of berries, there's
Crab
lots
apple.
of different fruits and nuts, and it's an absolute abundance of things that are now all of a sudden useful to us. So, a forest garden, you can open your eyes now if you haven't already done so. Forest garden is basically intentionally creating that kind of an edge. And what makes that edge function? What are the important components in that edge? I've mentioned several of them
Shelter.
already.
Sun, water,
Sun,
shelter.
water, shelter,
Different
Fertile
levels.
soils.
the different layers,
Yeah.
fertile soil. What about insects? What creates the fertile soil? It's all the insects, it's the birds, the bees, all the primary, secondary and tertiary decomposers that turn all of the spent wood into, there's not one thing in that environment that is wasted. Every single thing in that environment has its place. A tree falls down, bang. What happens? It starts to break down. Lots of different insects, lots of different microbes, fungi, everything starts working on it, starts utilising it. Nothing in that environment is wasted. And yet, how much energy are we putting in to actually creating that? None. We've never watered a forest edge. We've never planted anything there. We've never tilled the soil. We've never gone to home base to go and buy sackloads of compost to add to it. It creates it itself. So in forest gardening, that's essentially what we're doing. We're intentionally trying to create that edge. So we're intentionally looking at what plants can we actually add to this environment. So you look at its requirements. So if it's a sun-loving tree, you place it where it will get plenty of sun. If it's a shade-loving tree, you plant it somewhere where it has shade. But you have to think long-term. So what you'll see, if you've seen some forest gardens, mature forest gardens here in this country, it was an evolving science. So, actually let's take a few steps back. Forest gardening is not new. They've been creating forest gardens for, the evidence that I've seen is for at least 4,500 years. Though not many people actually understood what they were doing. So for example in the Americas, when I don't want to call them invaders, I don't know what the correct word is, when they killed off half the native American Indians and started looking at, they're just savages, look at the mess that they've made, quick, let's clear all of this out. They didn't understand the systems that they created, and yet these systems were so intricate, they were so well balanced, that that's what allowed their culture, etc., to develop. So when in Europe people started to try and create forest gardens based on what evidence they could find from around the world, they missed a few things out in the first early years, and so you'll see systems where things are just planted too close to each other. You know, so you plant 2 trees. Oh, I've got an acre of land. Okay, I'll have 10 apple trees right next to each other there. I have all of these. But over time, they've just grown so big that they're now all touching each other, and there's not enough sunlight between them to actually create environment. So now, as things have evolved, we've kind of realised these mistakes, or rather how we can tweak it to make it even more efficient, is you plant a chestnut tree there, and then 40 metres away, maybe even 50 metres away, you plant the next one. And they're only tiny. At the beginning you're thinking, my, what am I going to do with all this space? So you think about time. What is it that you can plant in these spaces which will, over the 20-30 years that it takes the mature trees to develop and become mature, you plant things intentionally in there which after 20-30 years start to kind of die back. One of the classic things that I do is I plant hazel. So in the first 5 years the hazel bush opens up and it fruits, and then as it starts to get crowded and crowded and crowded, you then start coppicing it for poles, because now it's got no light. You change its use. You could do the same with sweet cherry and various other things. So one of the most important elements of this environment, apart from getting everything planted right, is how do you attract all of the right insects and all of the right, how do you create the right biodiversity in there? So, and how do you get all of the right nutrients into your system as well? So the other big component is, if you've got lots of fruiting trees, how do you make sure that you've got enough nutrients in your system that, you know, as soon as it's fruited after 4 or 5 years, it hasn't taken all the nutrients out of your system and it just collapses. So at least 20% of what you plant are non-edibles. Now,
Like
some people
comfrey
may
and that
think,
sort of thing,
like
yeah.
comfrey, well, comfrey actually is edible, but comfrey is an absolutely amazing nettles, and it's a whole host of things. So most of the plants. Actually, how long do I have for this?
An hour. So
Oh, an hour. An hour starting from, so we've only had 20 minutes. Is that right?
yeah.
Ah, we've got loads of time. Okay. Yes, the comfrey and all of these other plants with really deep tap roots are what we call nutrient accumulators. So they will literally go really deep into the soil, pick up nutrients that are deep down, and bring them up to the surface in terms of their foliage. So when their foliage gets cut, put back onto the soil, decomposes, it then puts nutrients back into your system. It also, obviously, if you've got something like heavy clay soil, it can help to break your soil and therefore allow this whole life to start taking place. You know, it allows watering, it allows all the soil, you know, food web, all the worms and everything to start making their holes and really creating this environment. So one of the key things in a forest garden is to encourage fungi, because what fungi does is it can carry nutrients up to, I think 40 is typical, but even up to 100 meters away from where it is. Now, as you may know, fungi have a symbiotic relationship typically with tree roots, but also with other shrubs and things. And so they bring in nutrients, so from wherever it can pick it up, brings it to the tree. The tree then in return gives the fungi sugars, and so both of them kind of have this nice relationship. and the fungi can basically go, let's say, up to 100 metres away. So if you've got a patch of comfrey 100 metres away, and the nutrients that it has is required for your tree here, it's the fungi that will bring it to the tree. So creating this web is and creating this undisturbed web is absolutely critical. So as soon as you start digging your soil, you're basically, every time you dig, you're destroying it. Every time you turn soil over, you're exposing, first of all, you're breaking this web, but you're also exposing all of the insects and all this amazing web of life that creates soil. You're exposing it to the world, and it will recover the first time. If you do it a second time, it will maybe take a little longer to recover. If you do it a third time, half of it's just going to say, well, look, this isn't the place for me. And you'll see, as farms start to till their soil, the fertility just goes lower and lower and lower. Obviously constantly turning it, using heavy machinery starts to compact the soil, etc. And it becomes, after 5-10 years, it's then they really need to put so much energy into returning any kind of fertility and life back into their soil. So in a forest garden, it's completely the opposite. You just, at the end of the day, like David was saying about bees, bees know what they're doing. They know what's best for them. And the same, your environment, your forest, knows what's best for it. It knows what it needs in order to sustain itself, and everything will find its niche in there. So by developing a forest garden, you're literally, all you're doing is you're just helping nature. That's all you're doing. You're just helping nature to do what it wants to do. So for example, my parents they love gardening, absolutely love gardening, but they're well into their 80s now, and they physically just can't do it anymore. Every time they get a spade out for weeks, they'll be complaining about their aches and pains. So basically, in their back garden, we've created a forest garden. So it doesn't need to be big. You can create a forest garden as small or as large as you like. In fact, probably anything over 4 hectares is probably too big. So forest gardens work really well for either small communities or for your own personal kind of back gardens. And if you think about the energy that you're putting in to creating your food, and if you're looking at the output, it actually is one of the most efficient ways of growing food. Now, how do I qualify that? There's a lot of statistics, and I'm not going to claim to know exactly where the statistics have come from, but it's very often quoted. You're welcome to follow it up if you like. For every kilojoule of energy that it's taken to create 1 carrot, or for every kilojoule, that you get from eating a carrot, it's taken 10 kilojoules of energy to make it. So in other words, in terms of intensive agriculture, turning the soil, fertilizers, all the rest of it, to packaging, to moving it around the country, etc., etc. So from an environmental perspective, that's a total disaster. That's completely unsustainable. Whereas in a forest garden, what work are you doing?
None. Sowing the seed.
It's just harvesting.
Yeah. And most people who've developed their own forest gardens say they spend maybe 10 days a year managing it, and most of that management means picking food. It's literally just going around, oh, that looks ready. Oh, actually I think next year I might like to make that grow instead of this one. So okay, I'll tidy that up a little bit, I'll chop that one down. Oh, that looks fine, that looks fine. What is there to do? So the amount of energy, you're not watering it, you're not bringing in any nutrients, you're you're not turning the soil, you're just wandering around, enjoying it, picking the fruits. It's okay, it's taken maybe 3-4 years for you to design it, implement it, start to get it mature. So there is some work initially, but once it's established, once it's working, there's practically no energy required. And there's many examples of where people have developed forest gardens, walked away for 6 years, come back to have a look at the land, it's overgrown, but there's so much food in it, and it's taken maybe a week or two to kind of tidy this up, tidy that up, and that's it. It's back to its productive self. It's it's just clearing paths and things like that, and maybe something self-seeded that you didn't expect to come along, or whatever. But the important thing is it's so full of vitality, so full of life, lots of different birds and insects, and it's everybody wins. Everybody wins. You don't need any fossil fuels to make your food. You don't need to bring water in. You don't need to save seeds and start seeding things. It's a win-win-win-win situation, and it's healthy for all of the plant and animal and insect life. So what kind of things can you imagine you might want to plant in a forest garden? What things do you imagine? Would you want perennials or annuals?
Perennials.
Perennials. Why?
Because they're there year after year after year.
Because they will just
they're
survive.
perennial.
Yeah, they will just keep surviving. Could you have a space for an annuals in there?
Oh yeah.
I think you could. I'd imagine quite clearly having areas where you kind of just randomly put various plants. So again, I mean, the reason why the system works well and there's no pests is because you've got so much variety. I think Martin Crawford, who probably has one of the best research forest gardens in the UK, he has a 2-acre site and he has 550 different varieties of plants. So he's getting yield from 550 different plants, and that yield could be either edible, medicinal, it could be for plant dyes, it could be for colourings, dyes, could be for glues, could be sticks for making frames, all kinds of yields from it. So what kind of things do you imagine we could grow? What kind of...
Can you fit tomatoes in?
Could you fit... Okay, tell me about tomatoes. What kind of energy, how much energy does it require?
Lots.
Lots. How much attention does it need?
Lots.
Lots. So I would say maybe you could scatter some tomato seeds, and the first year it will probably grow, and it will probably grow well, because especially if you've got the right balance in your soil, it will probably do very well. But then the next year, if you put it in the same place and you keep putting it in the same place, it will start to deteriorate the quality and all the because it's so hungry for nutrients that it will start to upset. So maybe if you then planted your tomatoes in a different corner next year, and then the year after somewhere else, or how about just scattering a few here, a few there, a few somewhere else, just in a few select places. Again, you need to look at finding the right place with the right amount of sun, the right amount of shade, protection, from wind and all the rest of it. So I would say, yeah, you probably could, but you wouldn't necessarily have a huge abundance. You wouldn't be able to feed an army with tomatoes from a place like that. But you'd get enough for maybe 2 or 3 tomatoes a day for your family.
Because I'm not in the least being critical, but the thing that gets me is I love my tomatoes, so I've got some covered areas which keeps them warm. So how does that fit into permaculture?
Perfectly. Good interjection. So the majority of the things that you grow that you take no maintenance, that take very little of your energy, that's what you plant mainly around your space. But then those things that you do care for, like your tomatoes, you plant those closer to your home. You plant them in a place where you can spend all of that time and energy to go and look after them. So the forest garden is one big area scattered around, and the things which you need least amount of energy to manage, you put further and further away from you. This is a permaculture principle. And the things that you need to do more often and need a lot more care and attention, you plant closer to you, so you spend less time and you're more likely to be able to keep an eye on it. So yeah, so immediately around your house is where you would plant your tomatoes, or in your conservatory or greenhouse or whatever. So while there's definitely, you can design in how and where to plant your tomatoes, I'd say probably the forest garden isn't necessarily the best place for it. But definitely when you plan and design your space, you'll find the right place for it. Brilliant. Thanks for reminding me of that. Okay, so yeah, so what kind of things, when you say perennials, what kind of things can you imagine? Because this is an important thing. It's, you know,
Are we feeding our bees here, or are we feeding ourselves, or are we doing everything?
Everything.
Yeah. Okay.
Everything.
Yeah. Well, if you want perennial vegetables, there's Jerusalem artichokes, for instance.
Perfect.
Things that are staying
Which will
there.
tolerate a little bit of shade. So there's so maybe you can fit that in underneath a tree, south facing maybe. Yep. What other kind of things? What kind of trees do you imagine? Let's start there.
Deciduous.
Deciduous. Okay. Exclusively?
Fruit trees. Necessarily, no. Fruit trees. Yeah.
Nuts. Yeah, fruits, nuts. What consideration would you have if you were planting nuts?
Me too.
Other creatures come.
Squirrels.
Yes. Yeah.
If you're right next to a forest which is full of squirrels, how much yield are you going to get from your nut trees?
Not a lot, but you'll have some very grateful squirrels.
You'll have some very grateful squirrels.
Squirrel. Depends if you like squirrel or not.
Oh, okay. Yeah, maybe that's a yield. You know.
Yeah.
Maybe that's one
Squirrel
of your yields.
pie.
Yeah.
Squirrel with nuts.
I'm strict vegetarian, so I'm not interested in that kind of squirrel yield. But what they will do is they'll go and bury loads of nuts everywhere and pop up some hazelnut trees, which you know, they'll seed things for you. Okay, so we've got nuts, we've got fruit trees,
And then the bushes, so all your currants and gooseberries and
That's
all
right.
the things that really are forest edge things now, really, aren't they?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the layers of the forest garden, which you lead me on to very nicely, are you have a canopy layer, which is your kind of like a canopy in a deep forest. Are things which need lots and lots of sunshine, so they reach up and try and get as much sunlight as possible. So they're really tall plants. What kind of things do you imagine they could be? I mean, okay, let's say for example, if you had an apple tree which grew to 30 metres, how are you going to
Pick the apples.
pick the apples? So would it make sense to have an apple tree in that layer?
No.
Probably not.
Something like chestnuts.
So something like chestnuts,
something
yeah,
where the
which you
fruit
just kind of
drops.
get a few monkeys or young lads to jump into the tree and just shake it and let them fall, or even just let them fall and collect them when the time's ready. Yeah. Does it have to be a fruiting tree?
No.
No. So when we start thinking of nutrients, one of the most important things, nutrients you need, is nitrogen. Now, does anyone know of a particular tree or a particular group of trees that fix nitrogen?
Pea family.
The pea family, yep. So what?
So what tree in the pea family? Oh, what's that? Laburnums?
Wisteria?
I didn't know about
I
wisteria.
don't know, I'm not a gardener.
Yeah, that doesn't ring true to me.
No, okay.
I'm not sure.
There's-
And that would be a shrub rather than a tree anyway. But
No, alder does, doesn't it?
alder is an amazing.
Alder, nitrogen
yeah.
fixer. Okay.
They're basically, it's a family of actinorhizals, so it's not quite the leguminous family. The leguminous families, typically, most of the things in the pea family, the leguminous family, are sun-loving and
Non-shrubby climbers.
and they're either quite small, so they're kind of, you know, they're not so big, or yes, then you do have some of your like acacias and what have you, was it Siberian pea trees and stuff like that, which are again kind of shrubby, but they need a lot of sunlight. So when you're maturing your forest garden, at some point you're going to have less and less sunlight. So to rely on things like clover and, you know, sweet peas and your typical your typical kind of more herbaceous stroke kind of ground cover type leguminous, it's going to get harder and harder to get enough in there, which is why you then rely on something like an alder, because it will grow huge and it will fix nitrogen. So I don't know, so maybe something like a 2-acre site, if you had about 5 alders, that's almost enough for your entire site. But what's the problem with an alder? How big will it get?
Ginormous.
Yeah.
Ginormous. So how much shade will it create?
Loads and loads.
So where would you put it?
Right at the back, north.
The northernmost side.
Boundary.
Now another side of permaculture is, and I'm coming onto your shrub layer in a second, your berries and things. Another aspect of permaculture is everything in your system should have multiple functions. So if you're going to put one thing in, it shouldn't be just for that one thing alone. It should be there for several reasons. And so, for example, with an alder, what else could you use it for apart from to create nitrogen? What's in your...
Yeah, leaf mould, it's going to be, yeah.
Yep, leaf mould, yep, that's one.
I don't know what the
That's
fruits of an alder.
I don't think there's any particular
okay.
fruit on an alder, but
Could you
what's
use
one
branches?
thing?
Could you use the branches for something? Because they're quite
Possibly could use some of it for, I don't know,
structural.
building, yes, small structural stuff. In fact, yeah, alder wood is quite decent, but I wouldn't particularly want to take down a trunk or anything, but yeah, maybe some of the branches or something. I'm thinking more windbreaks.
Oh, right, yeah.
So one of the most problematic things in your garden is you know, northeasterly winds, you know, or these southwesterlies, and you know, so how do you protect your environment? How do you protect the more subtle things in your environment? So you need some kind of a windbreak. So the alder I would use not necessarily exclusively on the north, but more kind of northeast, to kind of act as a windbreak. So underneath that, so you've now got some kind of an overall
Starter
canopy.
point.
Yeah, the canopy. Then you've got what we call an understory, which are things which need a little bit of protection, but also some of which enjoy lots and lots of sunshine, some of which maybe can function well in a shady environment. So what kind of trees might they be? They're probably smaller than your canopy. So these are probably more your fruit trees, which may be only 3 or 4 meters high, which means you need maybe a small ladder or someone to stand there with a, you know, or a few people to stand there with a sheet, and you kind of, or whatever. It's much easier for you to manage and pick your fruits. But as I say, the important thing when you're placing your fruit trees is to place them imagining how big will they be eventually. You know, in 20 years time, how big is this going to be? Now if you planted them too close and they're touching each other, neither of them will fruit well. They will still fruit.
To prune.
Well, again, that's energy. Do you have the time and energy to prune? If you do, and you want to be pruning 2 hectares or however much land, or if you've only got a small, then maybe yeah. If you've got a really small back garden and you understand how to prune well, why not? Absolutely. And then you can actually afford to plant things closer, and therefore, but you need to realise that you need to then put that energy in. So if that's part of your specification, you know that for the next 50 years you've got the time and energy to do that. Great, fantastic, plan it in. If you don't, if you've got 20 acres to manage, that's your decision. That's your decision as a designer as to which way you want to go. Both are valid. So you plan your forest garden, you plant it out in a way which is, as I say, thinking about the future. But in the meantime, you've got lots and lots and lots of space. Lots of empty ground. So what kind of things might you want to put in there? In fact, you've already told us. Kind of more your shrubby kind of layer. So all of your blackcurrants and your blackberries and your Worcesterberries and your raspberries and
raspberries.
Absolutely amazing variety of things that you can put in there. So now you've kind of got three layers. You've got this overstory, you've got the kind of understory, which may need a bit of shade, may love full sun. Underneath and in between there, you've now got lots of currants and other shrubs. The next layer would then be some herbs, so kind of the herbaceous layer, and this is where you can really start to get creative now. So this is where you now really start thinking about how, not just what fruits you want from it, but what do other things need from your environment. So, or what animals, what insects, what birds do you want to start encouraging into your space? So and basically the simple rule is as much variety as you can possibly get. It's not to say that planting a verbenum over this or that is right. It's just the more variety you have, the more diversity you have, the more insect life you have, and therefore by encouraging everything in, everything finds its balance. So you haven't created an environment which is like, if you create like monoculture style rows and rows of corn, you're going to get an insect that says, "Ooh, corn, and loads of it, come on, everyone come on down, let's have a party," and there's no one to kind of control them. So the same with your tomatoes or your carrots. You'll always start to get some kind of a pest, whereas if everything's intermingled, you've encouraged lots of different insects in, there will always be a predator to manage the numbers of, whether it's green fly, slugs, black fly, whatever, weevils and strange things. They will all be there, but they'll be controlled because you've created a biodiversity. So at the kind of shrub, at the herbaceous layer, you can really start getting creative as to what you start planting. In that layer you could also have self-seeders. So they don't have to be perennials, but it could be that they kind of self-seed. So for example, walking leeks, they'll come up, the seeds, as they fruit and the seeds kind of come down, the new seeds, they kind of touch the ground, they then seed, and then next year that's where they grow. So they kind of walk around your garden as walking leeks. So what other layers do you imagine might be in this space?
Well, climbers can wend their way through here, can't they?
Climbers are another great layer. So what kind of things might you want to climb? I think
Honeysuckles.
Honeysuckles. Ooh.
Sweet peas.
Yep. Sweet
Runner
beans.
French climbing beans.
I've got, in one of my forest gardens, I've got this type of it's a kind of cabbage. Now I've not actually positively identified it yet, but it's definitely in that kind of that family, and it grows all year round. Even in the snow, it will still just be growing. It's it's amazing. It's quite bitter, but I tolerate that, and the young leaves are not as bitter. But I've got it climbing through one of my trees.
What,
So
its
you-
stem going up?
Yeah, I've just kind of intertwined it around and into one of my trees.
Do you know
so
there was
I'm kind of harvesting,
leaves off it?
leaves
Yeah.
like I'm harvesting it off of a tree.
There was advertised 2 or 3 years ago something called the walking stick cabbage or something, and it grew up and up and up like that, so that you could make a walking stick in the end out of the stem, a bit on the Brussels sprout lines, because that goes up and up and up, doesn't it, with the little
Stalk
sprouts
looks
coming
very
off it?
much like a Brussels sprout where you've stripped all the leaves off.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
what
so I
climbing
wonder if that's
spinach.
what you've
Yeah,
got.
it's not, because it's quite bendy, and
bendy.
wavy. It doesn't grow straight like a Brussels sprout.
No.
So
But is it bendy because it's got things that it needs to grow around, or is it bendy because it's not climbing like a climber? It's not. It's
I've
not
had it
doing
in-
wisteria, is it? It's
I've had it in different locations, and what it does is it has offshoots, and those offshoots
Yeah.
kind of start, coming
Yeah,
up,
okay.
and so, it.
yeah.
But it gets huge, absolutely
Fabulous.
huge. Up to about, I'd say, 6 feet tall even.
Oh, it is.
I have no
I'm
idea.
fascinated.
It's fascinating. It's lovely.
Yeah.
I can give you a cutting. It takes so
Magic,
easily.
yes,
You just
Sounds like it might be a pest.
Japanese knotweed.
Well, no,
Yeah.
you can eat it.
it doesn't.
Well, you can eat
It doesn't
Japanese knotweed
self-seed.
because it's still a pest.
Can you? I suppose. Yeah. Well, no. I mean, it's a different ball game.
Japanese knotweed is edible. So as long as you're harvesting it, it's
Supposed
not
to
a
be
pest.
like rhubarb and custard. Well, it's a pest in the sense that you'll soon have nothing but Japanese knotweed.
Okay, let's.
10 minutes.
All right, 10 minutes. So So what is a pest? A pest is something that you've got no use for, or a weed is something that's it's in the wrong place at the wrong time. And the reason why pests and invasive species take hold is because you've given it an environment which suits it. Now, Japanese knotweed does not like rich soil, so it will survive
Okay.
if you create an environment which is quite nutritionally defunct. It will say, yeah, great, love it. As soon as you start putting lots of nutrients into the soil, it's like, whoa,
Yeah, same as horsetail. Same thing again.
yeah, Crucitum. So yeah,
But it can just be a question of something being non-native, and therefore there are no natural restraints or predators, can't it?
what is native? Native when?
I know what you're saying, but
If you imagine the whole of this country was what? How many kilometres under snow? 10,000 years ago?
yeah, but 200 years,
200 years?
and people started bringing things back randomly without any thought to.
Yeah, I'd say 10,000
just
years ago
something
there was
that's
nothing growing here at
No,
all.
no,
So
that's
everything
right.
that found its way in found its way somehow, whether it was by a bird flying from South Africa, whether it was something that floated across the ocean, whether
But if
it
you
was...
want to benefit native fauna, then probably by and large. I know it's not always true because we've got Himalayan balsam down there and the bees are loving it, but it can be an issue, can't it? Because
Oh, that's a nightmare,
It can.
isn't it? Himalayan balsams.
If you
unless
don't
you're
want
a
it.
Nightmare.
beekeeper.
Well, yeah.
Oh.
Unless
And then suddenly you've got late forage for your
Well,
bees.
yeah, I've got
So, yeah,
4 acres of it.
yeah.
So it's a bit.
But if you're a beekeeper and you need late forage
yeah,
and nothing
yeah.
else is coming, then actually it's a blessing.
Anyway,
So-
I think we've got a
You-
few
you
minutes
said
left.
it, didn't
have
you?
question
You said
time.
it.
So, yeah, okay, quickly, questions.
My garden has along the top edge, as in a way, a sort of perfect starter, if you like, for permaculture. But they're ash trees,
Okay,
and they suck everything out of my garden.
right.
And I've fought with that. For actually, we're going to be going in a year's time, so this is sort of by the by. But I really would like to know how you would begin to map the trees that you've already got that are already drawing. How can you then plant things below them that will get enough nutrients when they're monsters?
There's a system called gilding, which basically you take a tree and you understand its requirements, and you then make sure you plant around it all of the things that it needs. So if you can make area immediately underneath it so rich that it gets all of its nutrients from immediately around it. It means that it doesn't need to get the nutrients from other parts of your garden.
Because my veg patch is in the middle of the garden, and one year I triple dug it with manure at the bottom in the autumn, and manure all the way through, and when I came around the next spring to plant my runner beans, less than a spit down I'd got ash roots, and it was dry, and it was, you know, they'd just gone yum 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 right the way through it.
Yeah.
So I need to
the other thing
just
is
tip tons of manure right in under the trees then, sort of.
well, not manure, I would be growing things in there, which actually... And the other thing is to prune the tree, because the more you prune it above.
But just as one example, for instance, what would you plant in that situation?
I don't know enough about ash, but I would be thinking definitely things like burdock. I'd be getting comfreys. I'd be getting encouraging nettle. I'd be all of these nutrient accumulators, you know, the dandelions and anything with a taproot. I mean, I can look it up. I can.
No, I'm just
work
interested
it out.
in an example.
Yeah. So anything which basically will bring nutrients up and return it into the soil as quickly as possible.
How do you fit chickens in?
Oh, beautifully, but
Sorry, how do you what?
Fit chickens into it.
chickens are great. Have you ever heard of a chicken tractor?
Yes.
Yeah,
I've got one.
Chicken tractor, perfect.
Yeah.
Maybe you'd like to explain how it works.
Well, basically, I call it a Sussex Ark. You've got a traditional, if you like, little chicken coop in which they go at night to be safe from the fox. I have a stained glass window in mine, so that when the first rays of the sun come in and I'm not up yet, they can eat some of the food that I put inside, so they get productive. And then when they're let out, they've got a run which you move across the garden. So as one bit starts to look a bit bare, you lift it up, move it across. So we're actually doing it across our lawn.
Brilliant.
And we've got a lawn that looks fine. And it's a very good relationship because they love the grass, and you move them onto their fresh patch of grass after a couple
They're
of
eating
days.
all the leather jackets and leaving the manure behind to
Because
feed
if
the
you let
dogs.
chickens loose in a garden, they can wreak havoc.
Oh, right.
But if you get bantams, you know, sort of, so bantams will roost in the trees. So chickens are a tree bird, aren't you know? But
Yeah.
we've bred them down to being ground.
Yeah.
But I've had bantams that have lived kind of semi-wild, and still, and if you don't mind, small eggs. And then suddenly disappearing for 3 weeks and then coming out with like 30 young.
But yeah, chickens in permaculture go incredibly well.
Because they're a really good protein source, aren't they?
I'm a vegetarian, so I'm not into...
Surely you have can't you have the odd egg?
I don't, personally. Though, but that's my choice.
Sorry, what do you call your chicken tractor? Sussex?
A Sussex Ark.
Ark.
Yeah, ARK. Yeah.
Right. Okay, I think we're pretty much on
Thank you very much.
with time. If anyone's interested, we've got some forest gardening and